Okay, thank you. Well, good afternoon. I'm Mary Bartkowiak. As Tony said, I'm the Forest Invasive Plant Coordinator. I work on the Forest Health team within the Division of Forestry. And a little bit about my background. I have a Bachelor of Science in Biology with a focus on botany and a Master of Science in Forest Ecology and Lichenology, both from UW-Stevens Point. So go Pointers. I am fortunate to be able to work on a team of very skilled and devout colleagues. You might know some of them. It's a great team to work with. So the Forest Health team, we have Forest Health specialists who work regionally throughout the state. So 5 of those specialists. We do have 1 vacancy in West Central. And we also have a pathologist, Kyoko Scanlon, who works out of the Forest Health Lab down in Fitchburg, a pest coordinator who just recently retired. So that position is vacant, as well as outreach specialists. And then I'm one of 3 invasive plant staff, and all 3 of us work statewide. So if you're looking for any information on forest health, check out our website. Coming soon, we'll have hopefully have more information specific to forest invasive plants. All right, so at the very beginning of every invasive plant presentation that I do, I really like to share our state statute definition, because it seems like nowadays you hear a lot of people using the term invasive species, and it's just good for us to get on the same page so we know what we're talking about here. So non-native species whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. So I think there are 2 really key words here: non-native and harm. So while dandelions are non-native, they aren't really causing a lot of harm, so we don't call them invasive species. Pen sedge, prickly ash, some of these plants that, depending on where you are in the forestry world, some of those might be aggressive and causing some difficulties for tree regeneration, but they're native. They've been here probably longer than we have, and so they're more of an aggressive or interfering vegetation. It comes in. It's really important to use the proper invasive species properly because of funding sources. So very little money for terrestrial invasive plants. We want to make sure that we're using them for the things that they're meant for. All right, so first off the bat, let's talk about garlic mustard. I know a lot of people have heard a lot about garlic mustard, but it's really, this is the only understory plant that I'm going to talk about today. And mostly because it is, it really is having an impact on our hardwood stands. So garlic mustard is a biennial. So the first year you just have the basal leaves, just that rosette of green leaves. They have the scalloped margin. And then the veins are sort of sunken. And so to me, they give that overall wrinkled appearance. Also, when you crush them, any part of the leaf or stem, there's a very strong garlic fragrance. And then the second year, it bolts and produces a flower stem. The leaves are more triangular. And then there are a tiny, small, white, 4-petaled flowers. And then from the flowers, the seed pods develop. They make a tremendous amount of seeds. And so it's really important that if you do see this in your woodlands, that you control it as soon as you do. It's really important. I like to share this image. This is a hardwood stand, a northern hardwood stand in Langlade County, so a pretty big maple syrup production area. This stand has been infested with some garlic mustard for quite a while. And while we realize there are other stands that garlic mustard really kind of levels off and just becomes a component of the understory, There are others that it just takes over in. We don't know why, what the difference is. If there's some type of management routine, we don't know, or maybe it's impacted by the soils or the amount of light that's reaching the forest floor. But for whatever the reason, I would rather remove it as soon as I see garlic mustard rather than taking the chance that this is what I could end up with, because it is quite stark. It is a monoculture. And you'll also notice there's very little regen here. There's a little bit in the seedling layer, but there's not even anything in the sapling hardly. So it's a tough one. We're actually doing a project with them to determine what's the impacts, what's going on out here. Share that next time I talk. So why should you care about garlic mustard? What's the big? Well, it emerges really early in the spring, much earlier than our natives, and it blocks out sunlight and it outcompetes for moisture and nutrients. It's also strengthened by our shifting climate. Our climate is shifting faster than our native plants are able to adapt. But garlic mustard, that's one of the characteristics of an invasive plant is they're highly adaptable. And garlic mustard is proving to be very plastic, along with the sheer number of seeds. So I said there were a lot. There's 600 to 7,000 seeds have been recorded for one plant. That's huge. And of course, most people already know, but garlic mustard is allelopathic, which is typical of the mustards. And what that means is it prevents other plants from growing too close. So it secretes a chemical or an enzyme into the soil that prevents others from growing. It's a form of controlling that competition. So it has more space for itself. So it's not playing fair, right? Not playing nice with others. So just recently, so I told you that it was a biennial. So typically the first year, leaves, second year it flowers, set seeds, and that's it. It senesces, it's gone, and then those seeds start the next cycle. However, we've been hearing about fall blooming garlic mustard. And we're like, no, that sounds horrible. But we never had a picture and we never had a specimen. So fortunately for us, last fall, a forester in central Wisconsin called and said, hey, have you ever seen garlic mustard reblooming in the fall? And so we took the opportunity to beg for a specimen, photos, whatever we could get. And sure enough, this is the image in the lower right here. This is the stalk and flowering stem from the spring. And you can't really see in this picture, but from the specimen you can. It has resprouted from the same stalk towards the base and is flowering and producing seed pods. And this was late September, early October in Waushara County. So while we recognize that, it's not all that unusual for plants during warm falls to reflower, especially those spring blooming ones. But it is a little frightening if garlic mustard is going to do this more often than not, because, that's just double the seed production in 1 year. And I don't know about you, but I'm kind of scared by that. So I must say that I think the Sugarbush book, the people who produce maple syrup are fortunate because they're out early in the spring when you can still see those basal rosettes from last year. They're visible. They remain green under the snow. So even if this were a normal year and we had snow on the ground, when you're out there working, you're able to see those plants. And so you're able to pluck them out of the soil and get rid of them before they flower. So not many people are out in the woods this time of year. So I think that's a heads up for all of you. All right, the second plant I'd like to talk about is common buckthorn. And again, real common. Everyone says, oh, I know about buckthorn. I don't want to know anymore. But what the heck? I think that this is it's our most common, but also widespread invaders. And it has a huge impact on both regen and accessibility for the sugarbush. Some folks feel that this one really messes up the ecology of stands more than any other plant. and we still don't have real good across the board. This is what you should do if it gets so thick. So we're working on that. If you have had the misfortune of walking through a bar or a buckthorn infested stand, it's hard. It's very tough. The thorns don't pose much of a problem, but just the thickness, the amount of stems per acre is crazy. I compare that to an alder thicket. And while I'm not a fan of walking through alder, I'm not much of a fan of walking through buckthorn either. They're both very difficult. So let's take a look at the anatomy of common buckthorn. This one has oval-shaped leaves with teeth on the margin. That's how a lot of people remember common. It's common to have teeth, right? So common buckthorn has teeth on the margin. They're green leaves, but they're not shiny, and there are small spines at the tip of the twigs, and the leaves are mostly opposite. It's also the alternate host of oat crown rust, which is in this middle photo. Not unusual to pick that up in the spring. The leaves should be, I don't know, maybe they're leafing out down in your area. They aren't here yet, but I would suspect soon. Buckthorn also is allelopathic. So mostly from the berries and the drupes, where garlic mustard is mostly from the roots and the leaves. So it also is altering the nitrogen dynamics of the soil, so facilitating that quick decomposition of the leaves. And that also causes a problem because you have you lose that leaf litter in the buckthorn, and then you have more place for other invasives, including maybe some invasive earthworms. So just recently, we've had a woohoo moment. We had a forester call one of our forest health specialists in Northeast, Linda Williams, and said, "Hey, something's killing the buckthorn. Do you know what it is?" And we were like, "No." Well, first of all, yay. Glad to hear that the buckthorn is dying, but no, we don't know why. So we did collect some specimens, and this is the canker. All of the buckthorn stems are filled with these large cankers. So Kyoko came up and we collected a bunch of samples all over. Well, the first one was from Marinette County. Collected that. Kyoko ran some analysis, found several different fungi. Not sure if there's a pathogen there. It was just a whole slew of species. Then we learned that Minnesota is looking at this too. They have the same problem over there. And then we received more and more calls. We have sites in Wood County, Waushara, as well as Marinette counties. We're still looking for more. So if you ever hear of massive amounts of buckthorn dying, give us a call. We'd love to collect some specimens if that's okay. But University of Minnesota has taken this on as a big project. They have a dedicated grad student who you see on the right here. This is Ryan Frank. He is teasing out all of the different fungal components from all of these specimens that we send him, and we're hoping that we can identify what's causing the buckthorn to die. However, it's dying, but then after a few years, it's resprouting. But we might be able to tweak this if we can find out what's going on, what's causing this. We're hoping, our goal is that we might be able to identify a biocontrol agent for this serious invader. We have our neighbors to the west in Minnesota have coined this the chocolate heart disease because this tree died the year before. We were out there this spring collecting some younger stems that are actively dying, or the canker is still developing, because that's the type of tissue that's best to run these analysis on. But this dead specimen, the bark is peeling off, and you can just make out that there's a chocolate brown stain to the inner bark. And that's what we're looking for. So that's the chocolate heart disease. All right, you can't talk about common buckthorn without talking about glossy buckthorn. Slightly different. The glossy has alternate leaves with smooth margins, so no teeth. And like the name implies, it's shiny, dark green, and no evidence of allelopathy that I'm aware of at this time. We used to think that glossy hung out in the wet areas and common buckthorn was more in the uplands, but now, they've either adapted or we just weren't paying much attention, or it was just too new on the landscape. But now they're all over the place together. I've seen glossy growing right next to common buckthorn in a super sandy soil in central Wisconsin on a red pine stand, and then common taking over in a wetland, a floodplain forest. So very highly adaptable species. So found throughout the state. Japanese barberry. This is one that you might recognize from the landscape industry. A lot of folks have this planted in their yards because it's a cute little shrub when it's first planted. It does produce tiny red berries, and the birds love them. And they devour them and then move those seeds to other areas, which are often our natural areas. So this Japanese barberry will create massive, almost impenetrable thickets that are really tough to deal with. And another recent discovery is that now we talked about invasive plants cause harm to the environment, the economy, or human health. Well, this one is like one of those that hits all those points. Well, you can see here, this is an infestation along the Wisconsin River in Portage County. It is definitely impeding regeneration and changing the soil, the light and moisture regime. But it has an added new nuance, so to speak. There's a higher occurrence of Lyme disease in barberry infested stands. And you might go, how can that possibly be? Well, if you look at how thick that barberry grows, it actually changes the light levels. There's very low light beneath those shrubs and very high humidity because those tiny leaves are really overlapped and there's lots of arching stems. So it creates tiny pockets. So small mammals like white-footed mice, they carry the Lyme disease bacteria. The bacteria does not affect them. But if they're going to try to avoid being eaten, if you don't want to be predated, are you going to hide under a hazelnut bush or a patch like this? Now remember, all those branches have spines on them. So they're actually very tough to walk through. And I would imagine it's awful, very difficult if you're an owl trying to snag that mouse on the ground. So this research has indicated that, higher Lyme disease in these stands, which is unfortunate because we do have a lot of Lyme disease in Wisconsin. The one good thing is this plant is actually relatively easy to control in your stand if you have it. Pulling it out, non-chemical control of just removing it works. You just have to takes about 2 or 3 tries to reduce that sprouting down to nothing. There are chemicals that are very effective, but it is controllable. So that's the good side, right? So most of us, when we talk about barberry, we often think first of Japanese barberry, but we actually have 2 species of barberry in Wisconsin. Both are regulated as invasive species. Common barberry on the left here was brought over by early settlers, colonial settlers, for jams and dyes and even hedgerows. But it is also the alternate host of black stem rust, which has huge consequences for our wheat crop, and in fact, all of our cereal grains. And so back in the turn of the century, a lot of people were hired to go out and try to eliminate this from the landscape. But the big difference here, I want to back up. Common barberry has teeth on the margin. You can see they're rather sharp. and then clusters of berries that dangle beneath the leaves. And then there are 3 thorns at the leaf node versus Japanese barberry, which was ironically introduced to replace common barberry, but having different problems with that. It's not the alternate. There are some cultivars that are linked to black stem rust, and those are not allowed to be sold here. But so let's look at differences here. Leaf shape, these are more spatula shaped. There are no teeth on the margin. A single oval bright red berry dangles below, and then there are super sharp single spines on the stem. And the stem has an overall zigzag appearance, and then there are ridges on that stem. Okay, back to black stem rust. So the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, DATCAP, has been doing a really good job keeping track of these populations and eradicating them as soon as they find a bush. They've been doing this for, I think, over 100 years. And so I dabbled a little bit in looking for some advertisements that might have been around at the back when this first started happening. And I thought this was just great. The barberry is kin of the Kaiser. This is from May 14th, 1918. So if you have it, destroy it and do it now. I thought that was great. And this one's my favorite. They really demonized the rust, which I guess they should. You know, back then, I mean, where we have corn now, they were all wheat, rye, and barley and oats. So it is a real a horrific rust that can cause a lot of damage. And so tying into that economic damage. All right, that's all I have for barberry. So between the rust and the ticks, yuck. Multiflora rose. This one there's a lot more of this in the southern half of the state, but it is moving north. I just talked with a group a couple of weeks ago. Someone told me they have it up in Clark County. So it is progressing north through the state. We do have a lot of native wild roses. So it's really good to make sure you're controlling the invasive and not a native. So I want to just point out a few features, some characters that will help you determine if it's the native or the non-native. So this is called the fringed stipule. So stipule connects the leaf to the stem. And this little tissue here has fringes on it, like eyelashes or little fingers projections. And then there's this thorn that looks like a cat's claw, and it's curved backwards on the stem, not forwards like most plants do. So those 2 characters should help you nail down if you have multiflora rose or not in your stand. This species produces a lot of flowers. So our natives, you might see, you know, flower, flower, flower here, there along the stem. But with the multiflora, you're going to see tons of flowers, very compact. So lots of flowers, and then a lot of the hips. These are called rose hips, the seeds that are produced from the roses in the fall, and they've become more and more popular in, say, craft shows and floral or fall decorating of dried florals. So it's something to just keep your eyes open for, because you don't want to bring home a bouquet and then throw it in your woods and then you got multiflora rose next year. Not a good thing. I wouldn't want that. It's extremely prolific and forms impenetrable thickets that shade out our native flora. So it grows so thick that nothing gets in. In fact, I just talked with a forester who has he called it a moat of multiflora rose that surrounds Oriental bittersweet that's killing the trees. So not a good situation. So want to keep that one out of your woods too. And then the last of the woodies that I'd like to talk about, non-native honeysuckles. So we call this the Lonicera complex. So it's about 4, sometimes 5, depending on hybridization, species that are found throughout throughout Wisconsin. We don't dwell too much on what species it is. We just want to make sure it's non-native and remove it from your stand. So all of these non-natives, are very dense, multi-stemmed shrubs with shaggy peeling bark. You can see that up here, almost like it's peeling off in strings. And then they have hollow stems in between the nodes. So this is a node right here, and then it's hollow on either side of it. So if you do just a straight cross cut, you'll see that hole. And that's what I do if I'm in the woods, and I sometimes test this. I know that I'm looking at a native, and so I'll take a look and just to make sure that it doesn't have a hole in it. It's not hollow. So that's a really good indicator, is checking on the if the stem is hollow. The leaves of honeysuckles are opposite, oblong, and they have smooth margins, so no teeth. And then there are fragrant tubular flowers arranged in pairs at the leaf nodes. And then the fruits they can be red, orange, or yellow, and they contain many seeds, and the birds love them. So I mentioned just a minute ago that I look for the natives, compare to make sure that they aren't hollow stem. We have two species of natives, Canadian fly honeysuckle, Lonicera canadensis, and bush honeysuckles. That's the Diervilla lonicera. Both are much shorter and have sparser stems, and they do have the solid pith. All of these invade woodlands and open areas, and they're displacing native species. They can become the dominant shrub layer quickly in a stand and form thickets that are so dense that very little light is going to penetrate. This disrupts that natural ecological function of tree regeneration. And this is a bugger to control. It's tenacious. It takes many herbicide applications if you want to go that route, and many times cutting and pulling if you do want to go with non-chemical. The best time to treat this one is in late summer to early fall. Now I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about worms, because worms too are invasive. Yeah, all of the worms we have in our Wisconsin today are non-native. So that means, well, we did have native worms, but they checked out with the last glacier that rolled through our state. So that means our forests have evolved without earthworms present. So over time, before there were worms, the leaf litter accumulated right on top of the soil, and you got that thick duff and then a dusting of each year's annual leaf litter. So it built up, and you got a pretty thick layer of organic material. And that layer helped to moderate moisture and soil temperature. And over time, it was just this gradual release of nutrients. So think of like that slow release fertilizers that people will use. It was just gradual and just trickled down and fed our maple trees naturally. So I'll take a look at this diagram. So without worms, we have high plant diversity, nice layer of duff and leaf litter, very spongy. And then we have what I always like to call a layer cake soil profile. We bring in worms, and all of a sudden we've lost that understory diversity. And because we've also lost the duff layer and leaf litter, so the worms eat dead plant material. They're called detritivores. And so they quickly take all of that organic material that's sitting on top of the soil and churn it down into the soil. And that's why you end up with this large A horizon and no organic layer on top. And the really sad thing, losing that duff layer, you no longer have that cushion for moisture and temperature changing in the soil, but you also lost that slow release of nutrients. So instead of gradual, it was like, whoop, it happens once, because the worms come in, devour all that organic material, and then as it passes through their body, it just flushes out. And so the trees have a really quick chance to take advantage of that flush of nutrients. So I like to say we do a lot of outreach to K through 12 when we go out in the field to school forests, and we do a lot of worm extractions using mustard to show the students what the worms look like in the soil. There's all these different types, and we always tell them, don't dump your bait. So if you go fishing, don't dump your bait in the woods. Take it home and either use up all your bait fishing or throw it in your garbage, but don't dump it in the woods. And so for foresters and sugarbush owners, I like to say worms are great for fishing and gardens, but they're not so great for our forests, right? And that's why in agricultural fields, we often see that we want that thick topsoil, right? The black, rich topsoil is great for growing crops. Unfortunately, what works well for corn and soybeans doesn't work quite as well for sugar maples and oaks. Okay. Excuse me. So in summary, earthworm infestation equals loss of leaf litter, and it also leaves the stand susceptible to erosion and additional invasions. Oftentimes, the worms come through the worms come through, and then more invasives follow that. Garlic mustard also often right behind, as well as the buckthorns and honeysuckles. And we also have that decrease in understory diversity, and therefore a huge shift in ecosystem function. So it can be devastating to see. You can almost, in newly infested areas, you can almost see the line, the invasion front, we call it. And then there's a new worm in town. Well, new, I think we found it 10, 11 years ago. Down in Dane County was the first known presence of what we call jumping worms. They're the Invasive species. They're different than our European earthworms, like I was talking about before. I should have been more specific. But those are the earthworms that you go fishing with, right? Or the red wigglers that are good for composting. They have like this slime, right? When you go to put an earthworm, a night crawler on a fishing hook, you get the slime on your fingers, and they're soft and gooey. These are different. They're dry. They're very firm. They don't have any slime on them at all. They're darker in color. They're almost gray. And they're super smooth. They're not squishy at all. The clitellum, which is this little section here, with European earthworms, that section is a little more pink and it's raised. It's like a saddle. Where with the jumping worms, it's glossy, it's a milky white, and very flush, smooth to the rest of the body. They're very active. They almost jump. That's thus the name. When you touch them, they wiggle and thrash around. Some people say it moves like a snake, but I don't know if I see that. But they can shed their tail when they're handled. And the scariest thing about these worms is that they're parthenogenic. So asexual reproduction means it only takes one to start a family. So all you need is one cocoon in a pot of soil or a transplanted plant, and you have yourself a new infestation. They also leave behind a very distinct soil signature. It almost looks like coffee grounds. So we used to tell folks to check your plants before you buy them if you're, buying your plants from a out of town or out of state nursery. Just check your pot. Make sure that the soil looks like soil and not coffee grounds. It's also another key feature to look if you are wandering through your woods or your gardens at home. Look to see if there's that very different soil texture out there. It's very indicative. These are annual worms, if you want to use that term. They overwinter as cocoons rather than adult worms. But their cocoons are the size of a grain of sand, so really, really small. And they only live in the top inch or two of soil. So they love to eat organic matter, and they eat a lot of it. We used to get a lot of phone calls from folks asking, hey, I just laid 3 inches of mulch in my garden beds, and it's gone. What can be happening? Well, jumping worms will devour mulch. They love it. And so if you suspect you have jumping worms in a flower garden or a vegetable bed, just move across the top layer of mulch or whatever kind of organic material sitting up there, and that's where you'll find them. So pretty easy to pick out. Right now, we don't have any known control. We also don't know of any jumping worms in a hardwood stand yet, aside from down in the Arboretum. Brad Herrick, who is our partner at the UW Arboretum, he's, I think, in his second year of a PhD program studying worms. So he'll be able to share more details with us real soon, maybe even information on how to control them. Right now, we have, like I said, we know they're annuals, we know they're parthenogenic. We know that the cocoons are very, very small. The adults don't overwinter. So if you see a larger worm in, say, April or May, pretty safe to say that's not a jumping worm, because at that stage, they just look like tiny wiggly threads. And we also learned from the first report that we received from the Arboretum was that the European earthworms and the jumping worms don't like to live together. So once the jumping worms move in, the European earthworms move out. So why that is, we don't know, but pretty interesting. Okay, so I tell you about the worms and the plants, and of course you probably heard about all of the insects and diseases that my colleagues from Forest Health talk about all the time. But when you have all of these things landing in one stand, silviculturalists like to call that stacked stressors. So you have invasive plants, earthworms, insects, disease, and then in some areas of the state, we have pretty high white-tailed deer populations. And deer really they prefer the native plants. So they're leaving the aliens, the invasive plants. They aren't going to touch those. So it's kind of like they're predisposing. They're helping the invasives along, even though they're not doing that on purpose, because they want to continue to eat. They don't want to eat buckthorn. Occasionally they will. So the earthworms and all these plants, they kind of mess up our soil microbial communities too. So there's lots of stuff happening once invasives start showing up on the landscape. Another thing to keep in mind if you do control invasives is nature abhors a void, right? So if you remove everything from your soil in the middle of a forest, chances are something's going to come back really quick, and it's not going to be native. So we usually recommend, like if you have garlic mustard and you pull the whole stand or treat it, whatever, try to introduce some native competition there. Otherwise, the invasion is just going to start all over again. And of course, it depends on what species you have there. Garlic mustard seeds last a very long time in the soil. We did learn, going back to our buckthorn conversation, just recently we've learned, because the University of Minnesota researchers have been digging into a seed bank study. And for many years, we thought that buckthorn seeds remained viable for like 6 or 7 years. They actually tested that theory and found out that we were wrong. No one knows where that 7 years came from, but indeed, 90% of all buckthorn seeds germinate in the first year. The rest germinate the following year. That's only a 2-year viability, much better than 7. So it could change the way we manage. But again, it's very site specific. If you have a stand that's infested and then all the area around the stand is infested too, then that propagule pressure that's coming in from the outside needs to be addressed before you're going to see the benefits of the 2-year viability. So, all right. So what can you do? Well, the biggest thing you can do is just be smart with planning and clean your equipment. Carry a boot brush with you. Remove plant seeds and muds from your boots, pets, and vehicles. A lot of folks use ATVs not just for recreating, but for working in the woods. And take a few minutes to wash that rig off. Get the mud off the tires before you enter a stand and then when you come out. It's a really good habit. We've heard a lot. I've actually seen this firsthand. Folks that have used their ATVs for whatever reason, deer hunting, food plots, maybe even sugaring. But they don't know that they just took that ATV out for a ride last night down a road that's full of garlic mustard and then drove out to their taps. And now they introduced garlic mustard to their stand. They didn't know it, didn't do it intentionally, right? But now you got to deal with that. So it's easier to clean your equipment. Just be smart about it. I hear foresters all the time that say, I wish I would have pulled that when I first saw it. Some folks will find garlic mustard or some invasive, maybe one or two of them, and think, oh, I'll get that next time I come back. And then they come back in a year and it's just gone crazy. So never underestimate the power of invasion. So I had a couple of resources I'd like to just mention quickly. The woody invasives of the Great Lakes covers our area, all the Great Lakes states, and has all sorts of information on identification as well as control. And then MIPIN, they're kind of like a sister program. MIPIN is Midwest Invasive Plant Network. They have a controlled database, tons of information out there. Take advantage of both of these resources, or I encourage you to take advantage of these resources. And with